Thank you, Tripp, for your kind introduction and for moderating this panel. I also want to emphasize how much I appreciate the work the organizers have put into this wonderful event. So Haas, the Grantwood Colony, Maura Pilcher, thank you so much. It's an honor to be here. I also want to say how grateful I am to my fellow presenters, and I'm looking forward to learning so much from you all today, in addition to how much I learned yesterday. I finally want to just acknowledge the Iowa, Meskwaki, and Sauk people whose homelands encompass Iowa City and give thanks for the opportunity to be in this space and place right now. So this morning, I am very much looking forward to sharing my paper with you entitled Tiling a Life, Henry Chapman Mercer and his Fonthill Castle. So Fonthill Castle was the home of tilemaker Henry Chapman Mercer, and it demonstrates competing interest in a romantic, sentimental version of the historical past, with the advances being made towards a new and modern future. Mercer played a central role in the house's conception and production, and it was fabricated by a very small team of individuals who were expected to adhere to his vision. As a result, the finished structure is a unique and highly personalized testament to Mercer's tastes, evidencing a man who, at the turn of the 20th century, balanced a concern for the contemporary with simultaneous passions for the antiquarian. Mercer was keenly interested in Gothic fiction, including the work of Edgar Allan Poe, whose complete collections of writings he owned, as well as his inkwell. And Mercer tried himself to write short stories in this style. Similarly, an interest in the Gothic really seems to have inspired the tilemaker to look to medieval precedents when designing his own home. He remembered deriving inspiration as a child from his grandfather's medieval castles, prints of medieval castles along the Rhine River. And in addition, his travels through Europe gave him design sources. So his wealthy aunt, Elizabeth Chapman Lawrence, fondly known as Aunt Leela, began sponsoring these trips during his childhood. And it was the inheritance of her fortune later in life in 1905, when Mercer was 49 years old, that financed the construction of Fonthill Castle. In England, Mercer had visited Haddon Hall, a rural 12th century medieval manor and banqueting hall, and this had direct influence on his design of Fonthill Castle. Both structures feature irregular roof lines with towering chimneys and imbalanced ground plans, and similar ornamentation, including the gray facing and leaded windows. Furthermore, Mercer's construction notebooks show he sought to achieve a similar effect to the paneling in the dormer room as is achieved in the medieval precedents banqueting hall. In some ways, Mercer's project recalls ones undertaken by many participants of the Grand Tour, such as Lord Burlington, who designed his own Palladian residence, Chiswick House, after his return to Italy, outfitting it with a collection he amassed abroad. Like Burlington, Mercer embraced the role of amateur architect, using his travels as a source of his inspiration. Mercer's distinct approach to the planning process resulted in an irregular layout that resembled the floor plan of a medieval castle. Mercer had no architectural training, and although he knew several architects, there is no evidence that he consulted them on the project. While he did not make conventional blueprints, his construction notebooks include sketches of the rooms and their floor plans, as well as dimensional calculations. Mercer primarily conceived of each room by molding blocks of clay in three-dimensional models that subverted rectilinear standards. Here, working with clay, Mercer adapted a medium he was most familiar with as a tilemaker for a new project. Once the designs for the individual rooms were set, the blocks were each assembled together to form an interior layout. The 44 rooms did not easily conform to a consistent plan, and instead of large stairwells that brought the 7 levels together, Mercer conceived of 32 stairwells that would connect the rooms, each of which had at least 2 doorways, allowing for irregular pathways through the house. Narrow passages and winding staircases enhanced the sense of mystery and surprise. In the end, Mercer worked from the inside outward. For Mercer, this meant utility was prioritized above all else. After finalizing the plan and making individual room plans to scale, Mercer turned his attention to the building's profile, experimenting with towers and roofs. Ultimately, he referred to the flat towered roof and the Jersey terrace as afterthoughts. A final plaster of Paris model for the house, pictured here, was used during the building process. At the same time that Mercer conceived of a unique floor plan, his interest in individuation extended to all features of the house. His construction notebooks demonstrate the ways in which Mercer was working with variations of doors, column capitals, even windows, of which there are supposedly 200. Unlike other structures, which conformed to the classical ideals of maintaining harmony, balance, and standardization, Fonthill Castle's designs celebrated its discontinuity. The construction process was experimental. Before beginning his tile-making business, Mercer had a long and successful career as an archaeologist, and some of his scholarly pursuits endured into the second phase of his life. Mercer actively collected tools from across times and cultures until the end of his life, embarking upon a separate museum to house them after completing his home, the purpose-built Mercer Museum. This interest in making and the use of tools explains Mercer's investment in the process of building his home. As has been discussed, Mercer worked with a small crew of only 10 unskilled laborers between 1908 and 1912 to realize this design. Mercer incorporated new technologies into the design, adapting medieval precedent to modern conveniences. For example, plumbing, an electrical system, an intercom system, and even central heating were part of the design from the beginning. Unlike medieval castles, which are well known for being chilly, Mercer augmented the heat that came from the fireplaces in nearly every room with a system for transferring warm air from the basement's coal furnaces. He also created a system of air shafts in the exterior walls to prevent condensation and dampness. Unlike a traditional castle built from granite, Mercer embraced the relatively new technology of concrete for the entire structure. Mercer subscribed to and contributed to the magazine Cement Age, which had given him an appreciation for contemporaneous projects being undertaken with the material. At the beginning of the construction process, Mercer had also attended the meetings of the American Portland cement manufacturers, which would have also provided a new understanding of concrete's properties. Mercer was attracted to concrete's supposed permanence and recognized the benefits of its fire-resistant capacity, especially given that his uncle had lost a valuable collection of armor in a fire. The Cement Age would even pick up an article from the local paper, the Doylestown Intelligencer, that reported how Mercer had celebrated his birthday with a bonfire atop the concrete mansion in 1910, causing unnecessary alarm in the eyes of the article's author amongst his neighbors. Because cement mixes were not yet normalized, Mercer's workers mixed the concrete by hand, using recipes that resulted in a coarse texture that Mercer preferred. The mixed concrete was transported in iron wheelbarrows or boxes with handles and then hoisted to the upper levels through a horse-powered pulley system. While the concrete was mixed anew, other materials in the construction were recycled. Frames were often constructed out of salvaged wood, including from old buildings and bridges, and iron reinforcements were taken from junkyards. In some ways, Mercer's work foreshadows more modern assemblage techniques that recontextualize found materials. Mercer was dedicated to the maxim of British architect and medieval revivalist Augustus Pugin, who called on architects to demonstrate construction, not to construct decoration. Called on architects to decorate construction, not construct decoration. In his own writings for the Cement Age, Mercer discouraged architects from disguising concrete with a facing of brick or stone, instead proposing they embrace it as a finished surface that could speak for itself. Here, Mercer again predicted a more radical turn in architecture toward revealing the inner industrial materials, including iron, that made architecture more modern structures possible. In the Cement Age, articles followed the construction process of Fonthill Castle, and there were illustrated articles that showed this process. And once it was completed, Mercer's home was celebrated for its unabashed use of concrete in a poem and illustrated frontispiece shown here. Because concrete's plasticity meant it could be sculpted or molded into shapes, the material allowed Mercer to incorporate design features from furniture such as vanities and bookshelves to structural embellishments such as columns and vaults. The concrete construction technique was especially well suited to Mercer's vision for tiled arches and vaults. In order to construct these arches and vaults, Mercer devised a system diagrammed in his construction notebooks. Before the concrete was poured, a curving layer of dirt would be mounted atop a wooden platform. The tiles would be placed face down in this dirt toward what would become the cavity after the concrete was poured, hardened, and the dirt was removed. So, black and white photographs of the house seem to substantiate its connection to medieval castles of the past, and the concrete easily resembles cut gray stone. Here, as I flip through photographs taken by the Historic American Building Survey, the building is set against a cloudy sky, heightening its sense of mystery. The interior shots, which often emphasize the vaulted ceiling, reveal experimentation with dark and light as it plays out on the gray scale. Indeed, the lighting of these spaces was of great importance to Mercer. In his design, he took inspiration from his favorite images, including a print made after Rembrandt's The Philosopher in Meditation. At the same time as the black and white images capture the play of light well, they obscure one of the key differences between Fonthill and a typical medieval relic, color. Instead, color images reveal the dynamism and playfulness of the structure. Most importantly, they capture the bright shades of paint applied to walls and doors, and the brilliance of the art and tiles. From the beginning, Mercer intended the space to be a museum as well as a residence. Mercer owned over 7,000 prints and engravings, placing 900 on display, which were accompanied by paintings, French tapestries, and over 6,000 books. Here, in the study, he even used chicken wire to showcase his collection of ancient Etruscan pottery above in the guise of a cornice. Most importantly, Mercer was able to integrate his collection of tile into the fabric of the house. The origins of the tiles were important and their provenance was carefully tracked. Much of the 1,564 tiles in his collection were spolia from China, the Middle East, Spain, and Holland. While many of the tiles had been acquired in Mercer's travels, both from dealers and directly from potteries, such as the Triana pottery in Spain, he began to aggressively add to the collection in 1914 after the completion of the construction project. Mercer rigorously pursued correspondence with expatriates, including military officers and YMCA workers, such as S.A. Filch, who was posted in then Peking, as well as Presbyterian missionaries, such as the Reverend Joseph R. Cunningham, who he contacted with form letters. In addition, he worked with American dealers, such as Lon's Curiosity Shop in New York City, and still more historic tiles had been awarded to Mercer, such as an old Bengali tile given to Mercer by then director of the South Kensington Museum in 1900. And a set of Delft tiles were presented to him by the Harvard Lampoon Society in 1907. Among the oldest tiles incorporated into the house were a set of Sumerian tablets that had once been used as receipts for goods purchased at markets in the second millennium BCE. These had been acquired by the American diplomat, antiquarian, and novelist Edgar James Banks. In addition, Mercer had pieces of red clay that were said to have been made in Jerusalem at the time of Christ, and other tiles that were believed to have been part of the original Alhambra. Mercer found intriguing and visually exciting ways to feature this collection, such as this set of Chinese roof tiles that leap from the concrete wall, creating a line that mirrors the flared skirt worn by Mercer's aunt in this portrait that sits nearby. While some of the tiles were collected, many had been fabricated by Mercer himself at his nearby Moravian pottery and tileworks. He had begun experimenting with tile later in life in 1897 after a career as an archaeologist, and he quickly made a name for himself in the business after he launched in 1899, ultimately patenting 3 different kinds of tile-making techniques. At the time he embarked upon this project, Fonthill Castle, Mercer was outfitting homes across America and even abroad. From one of his first commissions, secured through his aunt, for Isabella Stewart Gardner, such as in this image, which shows the tile floors of the House Museum's Gothic room, to ones across the United States, including in Texas, at King Ranch, and as we learned yesterday, for the floor of Alice Pike Barney's studio house in DC, which featured Mercer tile as well. In some ways, Mercer illustrated the dialogue between his collection of tiles and his own work by designing some tiles that were made in the guise of historical examples. So ceiling mosaics in the study are enlargements of similar reliefs in Toledo in the 16th and 17th centuries. Tiles in the yellow room that show a castle and eagle were inspired by 2 tiles excavated from the Church of Santa Maria in Seville, Spain. And more generally, many of Mercer's unglazed blue and white raised designs quote Wedgwood pottery's iconic style. In this way, the house was intended to represent the history of tile production. But Mercer also paired historically inspired tiles with his most iconic and recent designs, which were being sold at the time. Thus, Fonthill Castle was not only a museum, but also, as Mercer referred to it, as an exhibition home, which, like any showpiece, was a savvy advertisement. Already during its construction, Fonthill was a spectacle that had attracted attention. A 1910 report in the Doylestown Intelligencer recounted how Mercer had acquired a rooster and a watchdog in response to aggressive, even belligerent visitors. Once the house was completed, Mercer hosted prospective clients, including John Wanamaker, as well as other notable figures, including Henry Ford, who shared his interest in collecting tools, Marcel Duchamp, and John Philip Sousa. These and other guests would have learned about the history of Mercer's firm through the visual narrative incorporated by Mercer's successful past projects. The Moravian pottery and tileworks derived its name from Mercer's interest in Moravian and other early 18th century colonial firebracks. And the design of these motifs were inspiration for his first tiles. In his home, he set these iron firebacks into the wall alongside the brocade tiles they inspired. Other series were incorporated too, such as a set of golfing tiles that was commissioned by a country club, which were installed in one of Fonthill's bathrooms. And in one hall, Mercer set his scheme related to the Four Seasons, which had been designed for the Pennsylvania Capitol, which was one of his most successful and well-known, as well as extensive projects. Each room was dedicated to a specific subject, which dictated its tile scheme. The most complex arrangement at Fonthill was in the Columbus room. Here, the ceiling is occupied with scenes of Columbus's supposed discovery of the New World. Among other images recreated in tile is a map by Leonardo da Vinci and other scenes adapted from 16th century woodcuts. In the adjoining Bow room, Mercer dedicated the ceiling to a tiled map of ancient Mexico City. And finally, in the yellow room, there was tile work dedicated to the story of the pirate Bluebeard. The fantasy of travel and exploration was alive in this house, in these rooms. While Fonthill was officially completed in 1912, Mercer lived until 1930 and continued to add tiles to the home throughout his life. The dynamic space is a testament to the artist's own creativity and his ability to channel the inspiration he derived from a range of sources into an utterly new and fantastic vision. Thank you.
I'm glad for help. All right, good morning. I'll now talk about Maxfield Parrish. My talk's called Living the Dream, Maxfield Parrish and the Oaks. Parrish, who was one of the most popular and widely admired artists of the 20th century, also designed and largely built his own home and studio, which he named the Oaks, right? You're here seeing the main southern facade and the reflecting pool in the garden terrace. And he lived there and worked there for over 60 years. If we want to understand the nature of Parrish's art, and I'm showing you on the right Daybreak from 1922, his most well-known work, and perhaps get some idea of the reason why many people liked it, we need to understand the oaks as a material and experiential realization of an ideal way of life. This is what I mean by my title, Living the Dream. Parrish's existence at the Oaks was a living out in practice of lifestyle aspirations that appealed to many, right, including Parrish himself, and that he also visualized in his artworks. Most people didn't have the means or the skills to live like Parrish did, but they could instead buy a Parrish print and through it enjoy an idealized version of the way of life that he envisioned. So I want to get into the particulars of the character of the house and the grounds at the Oaks and how Parrish transposed significant features of his home into his art. But the larger case that I'd like to argue is that both the Oaks and Parrish's paintings embodied a dream lifestyle, right? A respite from the pressures and shortcomings of urban industrialized labor. This ideal lifestyle had a constellation of features, right, including natural beauty, sophisticated culture, community, and freedom. A primary aspect of this dream was to enjoy and to live closely and regularly with the beauty of nature. So, trees, mountains, water, skies, seasonal changes, flower gardens, vistas. At the same time, this ideal world was cultured, right? Not rustic or crude or rough. Freedom, right? To pursue self-directed activities rather than to labor for money was important, yet so too was community with other cultured people. Thus, the formation of the Cornish colony rather than isolated individual retreats. Parrish and his fellow colonists very much enjoyed socializing, conversation, letter writing, gathering at people's houses, putting on performances, musical and theatrical performances. In several ways, right, his dream existence entailed having the best of both worlds. So nature and culture, privacy, but also artistic community, living in the country while also maintaining connections to urban cultural centers. Lest this seem too much like mere self-indulgence, I should add that certainly for working artists like Parrish, the point of this existence was to be creative and professionally productive. So let's now go on to the particular case of Parrish and the Oaks and how he not only enjoyed crafting an aesthetically rich and satisfying home environment for himself, but also drew on his experience at the Oaks to imagine a closely related fantasy life in his paintings. Parrish's home was both the site and the model for his art. So let me show you the house and highlight some of its key features, in particular that its relationship to the land around it was one of its predominant aesthetic concerns. Parrish spied the spot for the Oaks from his father, Stephen Parrish's home and studio, which is called Northcote. And so I don't have a view from Northcote to the Oaks, but here's a view right from the Oaks under construction sort of across a valley. And then you can see here is Northcote. What appealed to Parrish immediately was a small grove of mature oak trees, which he felt were calling out to shelter a house. To give you a sense of the topographical relationship and setting of the Oaks and Northcote, right? Here's a topographical map with a blue dot for the Oaks and an orange dot for Northcote. They're about a mile apart as the crow flies. At the left is the Connecticut River, which is also the border between New Hampshire, where these houses are located, and Vermont close by to the west. Note that both of the houses are at the end of long driveways, and they sit on fairly steep hillsides, right? The light gray topographical lines on this map are at 40-foot intervals. And they face each other across a valley, at the bottom of which flows a stream, which is called Blow Me Down Brook. Parrish initially built a simple 2-room cabin. Here's a photograph of the work in progress, with the help of George Ruggles, his neighbor and construction partner and handyman for over 30 years. The first year, they only finished the kitchen. And let me say, this is the first of a number of images I'll show that are from Parrish's own collection of thousands of glass plate photographs that are now in the Special Collections Library at Dartmouth, which holds Parrish's papers. So 10 years on, right, in 1906, the two had mostly completed the compound. Here's a later aerial photograph. And you can see it includes a 2-story main house with gabled pavilions and a separate studio building that Parrish built starting in 1905, when, after the birth of his second of 4 children, he found it was getting a little too noisy and chaotic to concentrate on his work in the main house. Throughout the building process, Parrish designed the house to accommodate and to take advantage of the trees and the terrain. So the main facade faced south, looking out across a walled garden, and below that, pasture land that fell away rapidly. Here's a view from that pasture. And the house looks out toward the Connecticut River and beyond it to the landmark peak of Mount Ascutney. It's about 6 miles away in the neighboring state of Vermont. Looking toward the main house from afar, it consisted of a conjoined set of simple gabled blocks nestled beneath and amongst the massive oak trees. Looking out from the house, the chief impression was of the beckoning prospect of a vast, rugged landscape. Parrish's notion of landscape was always a humanized environment, right? Vistas that were anchored by and centered on people, often framed with architecture. In some of the most celebrated works of his early and mid-career, and I'm showing you here Dinky Bird from 1904 at the left, at top Garden of Allah from 1918, Daybreak, and then on the right, Ecstasy from 1930. The exultant or contemplative mood of the images derives from the relationship between the human figures and their surroundings. So this brings us back to the Oaks, which was both Parrish's own crafting and experience of his ideal, and the inspiration and model for many of his paintings. In some cases, the borrowings are quite obvious and specific. His illustration of the Arabian Nights story of Prince Agib features a large circular reflecting pool like the one on the terrace of the garden at the Oaks, which in turn derived from a similar reflecting pool in his father's garden at Northcote. The pool at the Oaks was larger, it was 16 feet across, more in relation to the house and the larger open spaces around it. We also see in his painting the cascading spirea prominent in Parrish's garden. And notice how these shrubs similarly, symmetrically flank a central axis / walkway. And the large decorative urns, right, like the one that Parrish received as a gift from landscape designer and architect Charles A. Platt and placed atop the end of a wall in the garden at the Oaks. One of the most prominent and remarked features of the Oaks was the porch or loggia at its southwest corner. It's here at the right. It was a space that joined interior and exterior and focused attention on the picture-like views of the gardens and the landscape beyond. And also, I propose, served as a key source and structuring conceit for Parrish's magnum opus, Daybreak. The loggia was built as a single-story structure early on in the process of expanding the house, with a second story later added to create the east wing. The interior of the loggia was a large room, about 20 feet wide by 25 feet deep, mostly open to the surrounding landscape on two sides. Parrish directly used his porch and himself as model in his 1901 painting, The Cardinal Archbishop Sat on His Shaded Balcony. This was a story illustration that first appeared in Scribner's magazine. And you see, yes, the distant view in the painting is of Venice, but Parrish has transcribed a lot quite directly from his own reference photo. So notice the bench with the cushions, the squared pilasters, the lion-topped column, and the table with pewter tea service and china teacups. The most notable architectural departure from the reference photo is the archway, right? And that is similar to the grand arched gate at the west side of Parrish's garden. Daybreak follows a similar pattern of patching in a landscape background, very different from what Parrish saw from his porch at the Oaks, right? In this case, it's the sort of craggy, arid, rocky landscape in blue and orange that had so impressed him during a 1902 trip to Arizona on assignment for the Century Company, for which he produced a set of illustrations for a series of articles titled The Great Southwest, right? They did a series on regions of the country. These images were initially reproduced in the Century in black and white. Just a couple of them in color, though, showed that color was so crucial to their effect that they later reprinted 7 more of them in color. So compare one of these, right, the Grand Canyon of the Colorado, with the colors and forms of the landscape in Daybreak. Along with the color plates, Century, they printed a long letter that they had solicited from Parrish in which he remarked, quote, "One has but to stand on the rim of the Grand Canyon, look across at the other wall 13 miles away, and watch it at sunrise or sunset in order to see color which can exist nowhere else. The low sunlight falls on the red towers and spires and causes them to glow as though they were lit within them. And thousands of feet down into the chasm falls the shadow, a blue from dreamland, a blue from which all the skies of the world were made." So this transformative experience of Western landscape was the inspiration for similar landscape backgrounds in several of Parrish's subsequent paintings. But of course, these are starkly different from the landscape that he actually saw from the Oaks. Here's a view looking south from the loggia in winter, with Mount Ascutney in the distance on the right, and the remains, the wintry remains of the grape arbor hanging down below the cornice. Yet, though the landscapes are so different, right, the Arizona landscape and this landscape, notice how similar is the visual structure of the view from Parrish's porch and Daybreak. A broad horizontal rectangle is divided symmetrically by two columns, right? The central opening is a perfect square. Lush foliage, right? Not grapevines in daybreak, but more like the profusion of spirea that we saw in the Prince Agib painting, hangs down somewhat miraculously from an unseen support above. At the skyline, contours of distant mountains ripple downward. So as Parrish mulled over and crystallized Daybreak, his first and most successful sort of independent art print that it's not an illustration or a commercial commission, the view from his own porch, deeply familiar over many years, gave him the cue for its pictorial organization. Many of Parrish's paintings feature a more extreme version of the paradoxical features that he brought together at the Oaks, right? A realm that is at once wild and desolate, but also orderly and lush. Vast, sublime natural vistas, but seen from and incorporating the welcoming built environment of a grand home. Freeing isolation, yet within a community and affording sociability. The Oaks was not unique or isolated, but was part of a close-knit community of residences and studios that comprised the Cornish colony. And as such, it has a few distinctive features, but it is also an instance of a type. Following the lead of Augustus St. Gaudens, the sculptor who came in 1885, several dozen artists and writers and musicians gathered near the rural New Hampshire town of Cornish and built houses or refurbished houses. Many of the colony houses had names, often chosen to create a sense of place and personal identity. And the two main naming conventions were natural features, right, like the Oaks, or on the left, I'm showing you mastlands, right, the Nichols family home, which in centuries past had been harvested for tall, straight pine trees used for ship masts, or family connections, like St. Gaudens' house, he named it Aspet after the French birth town of his father. Or I'm showing you on the right, again, with reflecting pool in the garden terrace, like at the Oaks. The Churchill family's house, Harlekenden, which was the maiden name of Mabel Churchill. Cornish colony houses commonly had gardened grounds to the point where gardening was one of the renowned practices of the area. And several colony residents, including Charles Platt, who gave Parrish the urn, and Platt's protege, Rose Nichols, were influential authorities on garden design who published books on the topic. This is Rose Nichols in her garden, and at the right, the terrace overlooking Charles Platt's garden. And again, notice the urns like the one that he gave to Parrish. Platt's idea of gardens as outdoor living rooms was particularly salient, so that Cornish gardens tend to be formally structured terraces integrated with the houses by means of pathways and stairs and benches and hedges and low walls. Also there are trellises and gateways, common features linking the houses and the gardens. For fear that they would detract from his beloved Oaks, Parrish did not plant the Lombardy poplars, right, that you see here. This is at Aspet, St. Gaudens' house, or that his father, Stephen Parrish, planted. These are the studio buildings at Northcote. But they're reminiscent of the Italian gardens that had so inspired many of the colonists. It was unusual, too, that Parrish neither refurbished an existing house, as St. Gaudens had, nor had a house designed, right? Charles Platt did designs for a number of the Cornish colony houses. And Parrish himself also undertook an extraordinary amount of the finished carpentry and functional metalwork, from furniture to cabinetry to hinges. And so on the left here is his dining room with a brick fireplace that he laid himself. And on the right, the entryway and stair looking back towards the living room in the west wing, so that the oaks, like we heard yesterday about Wood's houses and studio, was truly and thoroughly an artistic work of his own creation, even while it shared many defining traits with other Cornish properties. For the last 30 years of his career, Parrish painted almost exclusively landscapes, most of them as calendar images for the publishing company Brown and Bigelow. And this work, right, these Brown and Bigelow calendar images were arguably the purest realization of his ideal, both of artistic activity, right? This is what he wanted to do, is paint landscapes, and of lifestyle. The top sellers among dozens of such pictures, and I'll say just quickly, parenthetically, that I tend to pay most attention to the images that sold the most copies, because I take those to be the ones that were most culturally resonant and are thus have the richest prospects for analysis of widely shared values and people's longings. The biggest hits among the Brown and Bigelow calendars were the Mill Pond from 1948 on the left and Evening Shadows from 1953, each of which featured simple gabled buildings underneath gigantic old trees, a vista of distant hills seen across a foreground of rocks and mirror-like still plains of water. And both the sky and the water you see rendered in what was the so-called Maxfield Parrish blue, which was just a oil glaze of synthetic ultramarine. In these cases, right, and in most of Parrish's paradigmatic works, the basic subject is people inhabiting an idealized, humanized natural realm. But now there are no people visible, just buildings. And except for the glassy reflective plains of water, which I would argue Parrish has scaled up from the more obviously artificial garden conceit of reflecting pools, don't these idyllic calendar images look an awful lot like a distant view toward the oaks? As Parrish turned his back on figurative art and contentedly holed up at the oaks to paint what he pleased, he asserted that landscape images were really what his audience most wanted and needed in their lives, and thus would be the new trend in popular and commercial art. In a 1931 interview, he declared, "I'm done with girls on rocks." This is mostly a reference to the annual calendar images that he had been producing for General Electric since 1917. He kept trying to raise the price. It was $2,000, it was $5,000, it's $10,000 just for 1 year's rights. But they kept paying him, so he had to keep doing them. Again, notice the orange-blue southwestern landscapes in all of these. Again, continuing the quote, "There are always pretty girls on every city street." So you see he's here imagining an urban heterosexual male viewer. "But a man can't step out of the subway and watch the clouds playing with the top of Mount Ascutney." He could see that from his porch. It's the unattainable that appeals. Next best to seeing the ocean or the hills or the woods is enjoying a painting of them. End quote, right? So Parrish here presents a masculine ideal of refined country life and appreciation of nature as an antidote to urban living. At the Oaks, he could live this ideal every day and transmute that existence into his art, which could then become a next best, a vicarious art-mediated experience for his viewers. Thank you.
Thank you. Good morning, everybody. Can you all hear me properly? Thank you. Okay, and I go this way. This is Crow House, the home and studio of Henry Varnum Poor. Poor was best known as a ceramicist and a painter, but he also worked as a sculptor, an illustrator, a teacher, an arts organizer, and he had all the skills to make this house, hand make this house himself. He was at the center of an arts colony of actors, writers, musicians, and other visual artists on South Mountain Road in New City, New York, which is only about an hour north of Manhattan, but it's quite wild and rugged. It's just south of a big mountain called High Tor. This place sustained him for 50 years of creative life. And this is Crow House now. The property was allowed to decline after Poor's death and has been criminally neglected by its current owner, the town of Ramapo, New York. Why should Crow House be saved? Because the ties between this place and the work of Henry Varnum Poor are palpable. Saving the house and the land means saving a window into a creative process. Poor was 33 years old when he came to South Mountain Road. He was born in Kansas to a prosperous family of grain merchants and was expected to go into business. But throughout high school, he took manual and industrial arts classes. Then at Stanford University, he changed his major from economics to art. After college, he studied painting in London and Paris and looked at neo-impressionists, especially Cézanne and Matisse. He came back, got married, and briefly tried to make a go both of managing the family farm in Kansas and being a painter. This did not work very well for him. So he went back to California to do teaching and exhibiting his paintings. By 1918, when he was drafted into the Army, he had separated from his wife and daughter and established a studio in San Francisco with Marion Dorn, one of his pupils. He bloomed in France. He was a translator for his regiment, and he was the regimental artist. After returning to the United States, he and Dorn marry and decide that an art career was not viable on the West Coast, so they moved to New York. There, they quickly met Mary Mowbray Clark and her husband, John, who were both artists and had been organizers of the 1913 Armory Show and were much involved in everything new and world culture that was going on in New York. Mary Mowbray Clark and her partner, Madge Jennison, founded something called the Sunwise Turn Bookstore, which was more a salon than a bookstore. It held readings, it published illustrated books, and it had exhibitions, including 2 of Henry Varnum Poor's paintings in 1919 alone. Henry and Marion were, excuse me, is there any water here? Thank you. Henry and Marion were caught up in the circle of Mary Mowbray Clark and Sunwise Turn Bookstore, and they often spent weekends at the Brocken, a place on a country road of South Mountain Road. And Henry and Marion were easily convinced to buy land in the area, along with other artists, including Rollo Peters, who was a Shakespearean actor, and his companion, Amy Murray, a poet, folklorist, and musicians, and the textile designer, Ruth Reeves, and her husband, Leon Olds, an economist. Henry and Marion, who was quickly developing a career as a textile designer, moved to South Mountain Road by the end of 1919. Although Henry had no formal training as an architect, thank you very much. Thank you. As an architect or builder, but he had experience with the manual arts classes that he had taken in high school, and inspired also perhaps by vernacular French farmhouses he had seen in the war, and as well certainly by the Brocken, this vernacular 18th century farmhouse that the Mowbray Clarks had remodeled themselves. He took all that and just went to work and started making sketches and started actually building almost by himself. It was an ad hoc process, a pragmatic process using simple tools. It started in January of 1920 and was done about a year later. It's the poorhouse, the crow house, as it's called, is sited on a slope, and the buildings are built basically on different levels. It kind of marches up the hill. Material used are mainly hyperlocal: sandstone from disused quarries that were uphill from him, brick from a yard, a famous brickyard down the road in Haverstraw. And a fortuitous, for him, chestnut blight had occurred 5 years earlier, leaving some trees all seasoned and ready to go and to be chopped down by hand and adzed by hand and worked into the framework of the building. There are some very ancient building techniques: hand tools to carve and shape stone and wood, some new materials like metal frame windows, and lots of quirkiness. Massive headers over doors made out of chestnut beams, flat roofs of concrete and tar paper. When an archway in the interior of the house began to separate, Henry just simply added a buttress on the outside to hold it up. Here are the two facades of the house, which I'm just simply calling lawn facade and creekside facade. To orient you, unfortunately, the pointer on this thing isn't working, but look at the blue doorway that gets you into the living room of the house. The larger room on the right-hand side of the left screen is a...
So you push the top button. It's not intuitive.
Okay, sorry. Okay, so this gets you into the living room. This is the studio. There's a creek that basically where my green pointer is. This is the kitchen, backside of the kitchen wing. There's a Dutch door here that lets you out onto a terrace, and that is another door into the studio. This is the living room with one of those massive chestnut beams. Fireplace with stone lintels that Henry carved himself, that buttress or that archway held up by the buttress outside. Most of the furniture in the room was made by Henry. You go through that archway, enter into the kitchen with a massive stone sink carved by hand. This is the first studio of several I'll describe, made by Henry. It's an irregularly shaped room with a wooden spiral staircase that leads you both to kind of a loft for storage of paintings. And then if you continue up this way, gets you into the second floor of the house. And look at the big north windows. Those big north windows there get you out onto the lawn, where Henry established gardens and raised beds with ornamental plantings, ornamental shrubs and trees. The structure here was a wood workshop, as you can see, I hope you can see, ornamented with Henry Varnum Poor's ceramics set into the stucco work. The Creekside Terrace was a land work constructed by Henry, and was the atmosphere and the whole sense of it was augmented or changed very much because Henry dammed the creek. And this area right here was a small pool of water that flowed through that doorway that turned a grinding wheel for making pigments. Just after finishing the first phase of Crow House, Poor turned to really dug into what was to become one of his major mediums, which is ceramics. He basically taught himself how to make ceramics. He ascertained that there really wasn't a market for the kind of high style, low technique ceramic that he had in mind. And so he set himself, he both researched the market and researched how to make ceramics and just went to it. Some of the early pieces were, the bodies of the ceramics were technically not good, very flawed, even with glazes that would flake away and crack. But within about 10 years, he was really quite good at ceramics. And what he always conceived of ceramics as something like a painting surface. Rather than using conventionalized designs that other potters might use, he really treated the clay as a canvas. Before the close of 1921, and only 1 year, he had enough wares to sell to the Wanamaker's department store. And by mid-1922, he was on a $200 retainer from the Montrose Art Gallery, a place that also sold his paintings. And I want to suggest that Poor once said that he spent too much time making ceramics and he would have been a better painter if he had never taken it up. But in fact, in his career, the two media inform each other. He used similar techniques in both ceramics and painting. In both mediums, he used a lyrical line like Matisse, sometimes painted on with a brush and sometimes scratched through the surface with the brush end. In other words, graffito, a ceramic technique, or sometimes a plaster technique that he is applying to canvas, as well as clay. So you can particularly see that in the way that the check marks of the pants are made with a scraping of a brush end. But after a few years of country living, his relationship with Marion Dorn soured, and by 1923, they were divorced. After a time in France painting, Poor married Bessie Brewer, who was an editor, short story writer, and eventually a novelist. She was also the mother of 13-year-old Anne, whom Henry adopted. By 1926, Bessie and Henry welcomed a son, Peter, to the family. This was the third marriage for them both, and it stuck. By 1913, the family needed more room and they wanted more light in the living spaces, and Henry wanted a pottery studio. The new addition was built into the uphill studio side of the house. This is the new pottery studio. Again, Poor works in an ad hoc fashion, but this time with a mixture of new and old materials. He still used massive wood beams to carry the roofs and much plaster and brick throughout, but now walls were constructed of concrete block, and he made bigger windows with steel casements. He added another full story on top of that old studio and added stone facing onto the lawn side of the story. This new story became bedrooms and bathrooms. And basically where you see something painted brick, that's concrete block, and it's a new addition. So this is the lawn side. So this is the new addition. And that's the new addition from the creek side. This structure here is the same as this structure here. And that was added on later in 1949. But back to the 1931 additions. The most impressive architectural tile in the house, and perhaps in his whole career, is this bathroom. This was made in 1928 for the American Designers Gallery, a business venture that Henry Varnum Poor organized with other artists, mostly of the decorative arts, including Donald Deskey, and as well as several other South Mountain artists. The bathroom was much praised, both aesthetically for the playful theme of the nude in the shower, and technically for its glazes. He received several commissions for the bathrooms, and one version ended up here, installed at Crow House in 1931. The pottery is that one room addition built further up the hill, a fully equipped pottery with kilns, work tables, and was, the space he needed to make the enormous production that an output that he made. On the right, you see a bedroom, and everything you see in that room was made by Poor, including the table, the curtains, and that is a ceramic stove. And he never stopped tinkering with the Crow House property. In 1949, he added that bedroom bath wing to the kitchen end of the house. He built a small cinder block writing studio for Bessie. And in 1957, he built a studio for himself at the northern end of the property, overlooking a small stream. Stylistically, this is the most modern of all his structures, and he used it as a painting studio. Poor was definitely an artist connected to his materials, to the place he worked, to his home life, to the quotidian, but he was also a prominent professional out in the world. The list of all his professional affiliations is ridiculously long. I'll mention just a few. He never stopped being an easel painter and making ceramics, and he showed often and everywhere. He was perpetually trying out new media, including fresco. Again, he taught himself this technique, and by the 1940s was a major player in this field, often working with his daughter, Anne, who you see up at the top of the scaffold. He also made murals out of tile. He was a co-founder of Skowhegan, an artist residency program in Maine, and remained an effective and energetic board member there. He was for a period of a few years, he was a commissioner of fine arts, which oversaw the decoration of federal buildings in DC, in Washington, DC. He wrote 2 books and illustrated at least 2 others, and he served as an artist soldier in Alaska and World War II. And he also became the unofficial architect, or maybe the official architect, for the houses along South Mountain Road that were built by his fellow artists, writers, screenwriters. First of all of these was the house of Ruth Reeves, built right next door to him in a similar kind of style and technique as Crow House. It was completed just in the year after Crow House was, actually while he was teaching himself ceramics. He did houses for Milton Caniff, who was a cartoonist, Maxwell Anderson, the playwright, and John Houseman, the actor. By this time, by the later 30s, he was working in this much more modernistic style, using primarily concrete block. Houses faced the so that they could follow the path of the sun. And usually on the south side of the house, there were terraced gardens. And he was an active maker of the gardens, as well as Mary Mowbray Clark, who became quite a prominent garden designer. But I want to bring this back to Crow House and how that place informed his work. March Sun of 1933 shows Bessie Poor, Peter Poor, and Anne Poor. They sit in front of the garden window in Crow House with the cat sunning itself in the wan early spring light. The painting combines several genres that Poor expressed on canvas, in his drawings, in fresco, and on ceramics: still life, portraiture, and landscape. In fact, most often the subject of Henry Varnum Poor's work in any media is Crow House, his family, their land, and the world of South Mountain Road. And I want to suggest that Crow House is not only the subject, but the catalyst for Poor's creative life. Those are various Crow House subjects. From the first, Crow House is a place to physically and really viscerally engaged with the materials that he found on the site. He did this throughout his life, inventing new techniques of how to accomplish this all the while. The plate that you see on the right incorporates sand he brought back from a vacation in Florida, mixed in with the glazes to give more texture to the plate. While building the new studio in 1957, he was working on illustrations for Call of the Wild, the Jack London novel. He devised a method of drawing on gessoed panel, which had been inked and sanded. This gave him textural richness, but also let him use that free-flowing line of drawing that he so loved. I suggest that he worked out this method of illustration by making the overmantel in the studio, which is, I believe, a fresco painting, also that kind of gritty subsurface with drawing on top. And Crow House is a place to envision and try out spatial ideas. The shape of the three-dimensional gable is echoed in the doors of the closet, where it is flattened out into a two-dimensional chevron. Then that chevron is portrayed on a bowl that illusionistically portrays three dimensions. Poor was fascinated with curving and spiral staircases. They appear in the first iteration of Crow House in stone and in wood. When rendered in two dimensions, that chevron can look like the stairs climbing up the curved surface of the bowl. And I want to suggest that Poor's creative life was immeasurably enriched by the colony of creatives on South Mountain Road. And at the head of this for Poor was Bessie Brewer. Bessie was wife, mother, hostess, and writer. She wrote short stories and novels, radio scripts, and one play. Her fictional work is about women struggling to assert their emotional, sexual, and social needs in their sidelined roles as daughters, wives, and lovers. She was certainly a part of the theater and film world of South Mountain Road. She was also a part of the design world. A quote from a 1928 review of a Ruth Reeves textile show in the American Designers Gallery exhibit is quite revealing. Miss Reeves has a sense of comedy, which she knows how to constrain into proper wall harmonies. One of her best linens involves herself, Martha Ryther, Mrs. Varnum Poor, a cat, a stove, various things and personalities important to her own home life. I don't have time, but there are so many avenues to look into with Henry Varnum Poor and his relationship with the South Mountain Road colony. Poor himself did work in textile, and this is an avenue that is not much known or looked into. How he interacted with his first wife, or second wife, Marion Dorn, who was a textile designer, is not known. They apparently did remain on somewhat good terms. And his next door neighbor, Ruth Reeves, was a textile designer. And along with Martha Ryther, another of the South Mountain Road colonists who was married to a painter, Morris Cantor. So this interchange between painting and textile design is obviously critical. Poor made many, many drawings of military life and paintings, and his interactions with Milton Caniff and Bill Malden, who were both cartoonists who portrayed the kind of drama and emotional richness of military life. That is something that could be looked into quite a bit more. Poor had ties to the theater world since his earliest days on South Mountain Road. And I think stage set and set design comes to influence his work. On the left is a ceramic that he entitled Romeo and Juliet, and it is obviously a three-dimensional realization of or kind of a conglomeration of scenes from Romeo and Juliet. And on the right is a so-called poker room that was made for Ben Hecht, quite a somewhat notorious screenwriter. And as you can see, these two different things in two different scales are basically kind of pie-shaped, wedge-shaped structures, fantasy structures that are supposed to, they're theater pieces. Poor died in 1970, Bessie in 1975, and Anne lived on in the house until her death in 2002. Peter Poor decides that the house is too much of a burden for his family, and he decided to sell it. Friends of Crow House was formed, an organization, a nonprofit, and to convince the next owners who wanted to raise the house to give them enough time to find some other solutions for it. The solution was that the town of Ramapo bought the house and it came with a preservation covenant that guaranteed public access and preservation of the structures and the grounds. Well, almost immediately, the town of Ramapo just did not fulfill any promises and let the house slide into really deep neglect. Electricity was turned off for a while. Several hurricanes blew through, and for a while, the kind of little bridge over a creek to the house was blown out, and the house was inaccessible. But the town of Ramapo has much bigger issues because in 2018, the town supervisor was convicted of securities fraud that had little to do with Crow House, maybe. And he was sentenced to jail and, not much attention is being paid to Crow House. The most recent town supervisor is more interested in Crow House, and some quite needed and emergency repairs have been done over the last 6 months or so, which is very good news. So why save Crow House? Because the physical place tells us so much about this artist. Poor's art and the house and the land live in symbiosis, and the community too nurtured itself. All this history alone, of course, is worthwhile, but it's more than history. I think this symposium is demonstrating quite well that place and creativity are linked, and that when we today come to these places, we have insight into creativity. But as good as these papers are, it's not as good as being there. But is it too far gone to save? There has been much damage in the last 15 years, especially, but there are really, really good signs. The structure can be repaired. Garden is overgrown, several berms need shoring up, but the bones of the land are not very damaged. Many of the furnishings are still owned by the family who are involved with the foundation, and the papers of Poor have been given to the Archives of American Art. What is the best, highest use for Poor House? Of course, it could be a historic house museum. It could be an artist residency program or a scholar study or a conference center done in partnership with a nonprofit. It could even revert to private use as long as there were accommodations made for accessibility and maintenance. So the hero in all of this is the Henry Varnum Poor Foundation. And just to close my talk, I'm going to be a bit of an activist here and say that I have brought along a letter written to the town of Ramapo supervisor, which if you all would like to sign would be most appreciated. Thank you very much this morning. Thank you very much.
So I'll use this microphone to make it.
Okay. It'll be up there, but also.
Oh, I see. Yeah. That's great. Well, thank you so much to our speakers, three incredible projects and houses that you all have introduced us to. I am going to transition us now into Q&A. We will take a look at the chat for those of you who are joining us online, encourage questions from the audience. But I'm just going to take executive privilege here first and start us off by asking you all to what extent the creators of these homes actively envisioned them as museum spaces. I think it's maybe a little bit more clear for Mercer, who basically is sort of like, tied his poor housekeeper to the house for the rest of her life as a tour guide. But I wonder if the three of you could talk about the ways in which these creators thought about the posterity of these buildings as public institutions and how that might have affected the way that they were created. We can just go down the line.
I'm happy to get it started. Thank you. That's such a great question. So I mentioned in the talk that Mercer really envisioned his house to be a museum. At the same time, he went on to build a separate museum, the Mercer Museum, for his collection of tools. So the house is a little bit different from the museum, which is you're more free to wander, I think, as like a typical museum. The house is more intended to be experienced through a tour. And as you mentioned, so Mercer used to give tours himself, but when he passed away, the foreman of his factory, he and his wife had lived at the house, and his wife was kind of the caretaker of the house. And so in perpetuity, Mercer left the house to Bucks County and requested that this caretaker remain on the property to give these tours. And so it was in some ways open to the public as a museum until she passed away, at which point it became more of the established museum that we see today.
In Parrish's case, not at all did he think of it as a museum. It was a place for him to live and to work, and he pretty much his entire career spent there. He stopped painting in 1962. He still lived there. He died there in 1966, by which time he needed a nurse, but still there was no talk of converting it or leaving it. It remained private property. A Parrish dealer and advocate, Alma Gilbert, bought the house in 1978. And she opened a museum, and she was going to try to fund that with a restaurant and hotel. But unfortunately, the main house a year later in 1979 burned to the ground. And she rebuilt it. But I mean, so this is part of the reason why it's you know, like it's not part of Hawes, because it's that most of it is not there, or it's been heavily redone.
Poor definitely did not see his house as a museum. I think he would have valued this. It was an artist colony, and it was a center of an artist colony. I think he would have valued saving that as an idea. He valued the house, obviously, he valued the property, but as a public place, that was not part of his vision, I don't think.
Thanks. Questions from the audience? Folks have questions out here. Yes.
So all these three buildings really like designed and are hand built by the artist. So are there any limitations to calling them works of art or total art? Would that sort of benefit by the categorical shift from being artist works to go to actual an artist work?
Repeat the question.
Oh, sorry, I should have done that. I'll try to address this. Sort of like, are there limits to which these houses themselves can be considered works of art? Is that a fair enough summary?
I think of Poor's house as, yes, a work of art. The whole, not only the house, but all the structures and the land. I'm a sucker for that argument. I really think of all artist houses as artworks, and I think many people who are not artists make houses that are artful, that function as immersive creative environments too. So you won't get any argument from me.
Yeah, I mean, I know there's a practical side to that question about would it do any good for preservation and appreciation, and then there's a sort of conceptual, categorical side to that. I mean, Parrish himself, you know, he was remarked at the time as like, wow, it's amazing that you know, as a painter, you're such a skilled mechanic, and he would joke like, no, actually, I'm a mechanic who also paints. So it was an important part of his artistic practice as he thought of it. But I don't know. Then I would say, but then okay, you know, like as you were like, well, what is the person most known for, or what is their best work? And I would say, in Parrish's case, like, yeah, his house is really cool, but his paintings are what he's most highly regarded for, and maybe, you know, at the time and for subsequent his main work. Although, yeah, as I said, like his house was remarked in his own day. It was published many times in magazines as to say, boy, this is a notable work of art in its own right.
Thank you for your question. I think it's really interesting to think, absolutely, I believe that Fonthill Castle is a total work of art. At the same time, I think that, as I was saying, you know, there's individual tile schemes that he incorporated that are seen elsewhere. And so the friction between thinking of those as individual art pieces and then reading them into the room as a piece of art, and then what it means to be part of the larger structure. I think that there's various scales of interpretation. And so while I think of Fonthill Castle as a total work of art, I also think that you can think about all the individual pieces functioning almost independently as well as they function together.
Yes.
This is for Olivia. What's the biggest conservation challenge for you at the museum?
And just to repeat, what is the greatest conservation challenge at Fonthill Castle?
Unfortunately, I don't have a good answer for you, but I can do some investigating and get back to you.
Yes.
Less a question than a comment on the discussion. With the question whether something is its own work of art. I think it's a really good question for the last couple of days to sort of think about. And there is, it seems to me, at the turn of the 19th, particularly the 20th century, there is a notion of the home as a work, or of the artist's home as a work of art. And Mercer would be our today's best example of that, I think, where in some ways he's creating a space that in no way is just a little domestic dwelling itself, but rather something that is a vision. And he's got to have a public in mind, whether it's public, the present, the public of the future. And I do see within our house properties differences between those that make self-consciously integrated a totality of vision, not incrementally done, but really having a wholeness to it. That is a Kunstwerk or a Gesamtkunstwerk. And then there are more like what I think the other two would have been describing, which are homes that, while it would be wonderful if the oaks were still around, you have to have wonderful documentation, it seems, from those photographs. But really, that was just for a lifestyle of a particular moment, and without, as you say, a sense of in perpetuity, and so on. And then maybe poor comes both out of that crafted tradition of the early 20th century, but just given the character that he is, and his, sounds like he didn't have much money, as well as being very good at doing what he was doing. It's really for the moment, and it's a particular. Why I love saving something like that is because it describes really an individual moment and an individual lifestyle. And I think that's what's very much an alternative to a lot of other lifestyles at that moment and today. So sometimes I think they should be saved just if they've got as much to offer as Grovehouse does. Anyway, you can't summarize.
Well, I'll try to do my best, Wanda. So for our virtual audience, Wanda Korn has just given a much more eloquent look at these artists' houses than I could probably recapitulate. But to put it in a nutshell, the notion really is that the collection of houses under Haas's guidance, or that we think of as artists' houses, run a full gamut from the total work of art, the Gesamtkunstwerk house, which is really conceived as a product unto itself, to these houses that were settings for lifestyles or settings for a particular approach to an artist's practice that are in many ways every bit is worth preserving as sort of windows into a particular moment or particular approach to craft or to art, as something that is much more recognizably kind of a work of art unto itself. Hopefully that was fair enough. All right, others, yes. Call it what? Architecture. I like that as a new term for these. I had a quick question about, or maybe it's not a quick question, of in some ways the disconnect between the artistic practice and the homes that we're talking about. I think often with artistic or sort of artist homes, there's this belief that they are somehow showcases for clients or for patrons. And when I think about Mercer's work, certainly he had a great range of clients, but those visiting his house might have run for the hills if they had seen some of those interiors. When we think about the oaks, it's almost as if there's a green screen where you see the house but it gets sort of inserted with these sort of much more kind of exotic landscapes in that sort of earlier style. And when you look at, you know, Poor's ceramics, I think immediately of like Italian Majolica or something along those lines, as opposed to, I wouldn't have immediately have associated them with that house. So I'm wondering if the three of you can talk about that disconnect between what was kind of privately created for themselves versus what the public or a patron or a client might have expected or wanted.
Yeah, I think it's interesting to think about. I mean, there's an rather obvious connection in terms of Mercer's artistic expression, and that his house is embellished all over with tile, and that's what his profession was. So you, I think, can see the immediate connection there. I think that one thing I was trying to get into with the concrete was kind of an exploration of an alternative materiality to clay. So I think that in some ways, I mean, I think he was really interested in this ostensible moldability of the concrete, and that it could be cast into so many different forms. So maybe thinking about kind of a translatable materiality in architecture. At the same time, I think, just to address your question about the role clients played, I think that he did conceive of it as a showcase, but he was also, I read some interesting stories about various people that did visit Fonthill Castle, and I think that he was a little bit selective in his own invitations. And so I do know that, at least for Henry Ford, when he came to visit Fonthill Castle, Mercer actually kind of didn't disinvite him, but he wasn't allowed to stay overnight versus other people were. So he was kind of required to go find some other place to sleep. So I think that it would be interesting if there is more documentation, which I don't know about, to know more about how these visits took place, what Mercer's tour of the structure was like, and what kinds of interactions happened on that tour, to kind of see whether people were, as you say, kind of overwhelmed and in some ways repulsed by the structure.
Well, it seems like the rare client would have walked in and said, "I've got to have that ceiling," you know.
Parrish or the Oaks, I would say there are two types of visitors. One is people from the colony, from the Cornish colony. That leftmost block of the house was built last, was a music room. It had a panel screen and theater at one end of it. So he's very much thinking of that as a place for the community to gather. But in terms of like clients, professional contacts, he's mostly trying to hold them at a distance, you know, so that he's famous. People want to come talk, you know, I'd like to write a magazine article about you, or, you know, I'd like to, could I please convince you to, you know, do an ad for our company, or, you know, and he would say to those people, he would say, oh, you know, that they're certainly not in the winter. There's no way you can get up here. You know, the roads are, he would just use any excuse to try to say, please do not come if you're a professional contact.
Right. Interesting.
I would say that I am not as knowledgeable about Poor's professional career to speak really accurately to this question, but my sense is that he understood how to market himself and his work. And I don't think that had a huge amount to do with Crow House, although there were articles written about him and about Crow House, and that was a way of inviting the public in. So I would say that the house was really for himself and his family and the colony, rather than, and that Crow House out in the world was stagecrafted for broader public consumption, because the colony was somewhat known through all sorts of magazine articles, and because the theater world was so well known. And Poor was always discussed is at the center of it all. But the specifics of Crow House were not really brought into that discussion, I think.
Right.
But I'd have to know more.
Well, I mean, this sort of almost goes back to, what Wanda was saying about the real value and range of these houses, which is that, some were conceived as sort of show places that a public was going to be, welcomed into, both in the lifetime of the creator and later on. Those that become more kind of retreats for a small group, or even for themselves, as museums become really kind of fascinating ways for us to step into a space that we might not have been able to have approached in the lifetime of the creator. We do have a question here from our remote audience. This is for Michael. I'm struck by how Parrish's later calendar landscapes published by B&B seem to feature slightly more quaint, cozy cottages or farmhouses rather than the grand palazzos of some of the earlier work or illustrations for fictional works. In your view, do the houses of Parrish and his artist colleagues of Cornish seem more like grand country estates or more modest settings? I think of them as distinct kinds of escapism, the grand palaces of imagination versus the nostalgia of the country cottage, or are these not actually opposed? So how do those two different architectural types kind of play out?
Yeah, so I mean, I think that just as is implicit in the question, that the earlier ones are fantasy castles and the later ones are more based, I mean, like I would say that they're based on his actual house. And then also, this is something, I mean, I appreciate the question. This is something that I'm still trying to think through and work through, is I think that there's also a shift in cultural moment, so that the calendars are post-World War II nostalgia for a, purportedly traditional New England way of life. So yeah, I mean, I think that, and then also just that's related to the personal transition that Parrish has. He wanted to get out of commercial art pretty much as soon as he got into it. He was just as a college student, he was beginning to be very successful, and then he wanted to quit, and he finally was able to quit, and no more girls on rocks. And this was what he wanted to do, is just paint landscapes and live as he did at the Oaks. And so I think you're getting a picture later on of, for the viewer, it's a fantasy. For him, that was, he had succeeded in really living his ideal life.
Right. Great. Thanks. Well, I know that I don't want to impinge too much on folks' lunch hour time. We may have time for one quick question if we've got one. Yeah.
Interested in little tidbits of information or maybe even gossip about Marcel Duchamp's Fonthill Castle and Crow House.
I tried to find more information about it and I could not find it in what I had. I wonder if there's anything with Duchamp's archives. I am very curious, but I also was so excited that he visited Crow House. It seems like an interesting juxtaposition. The way I figured it was that he was in Philadelphia for the Philadelphia Museum of Art or some other connection there, and then it just made logical sense.
The artist groups.
In there. But I don't have more information. I'm sorry, but it's a to-do on my research list.
Well, I was just saying, he was immensely interested in memoirs. So when he was in Munich, they made this before he made Bride's Fair Fashion, before he decided to get on painting, he went to the Munich trade fair show, and he wrote copiously about experience there. So he was in love with that things. In fact, that industry changing, and realized, where am I going to go paint? Like, there's more of your electric art. Who knows the searches started painting art. So he had a deep love. but I don't think a lot, it's a German scholar know about it.
Yes, all I can say, I was delighted to see that Marcel Duchamp, how much he got around. It was great.
Great.
And I don't know a lot about why he ended up at Crow House, but the Henry Varnum Poor and a lot of the other artists he hung out with on South Mountain Road were very involved with the New York Dada scene and the New York avant-garde. So it's not too surprising to find him coming up for lunch on the terrace. Yeah.
And that's a great transition. We are